Unknown planets, legendary battles, and incredible stories await you here. But don't forget to be a part of this universe. Subscribe, like, comment, be a part of this great adventure. The colossal warship Eterna Pax hung in Earth's orbit like an executioner's blade, its steel surface catching the planet's pale blue glow. A vessel of conquest masquerading as an enforcer of peace. Within its command chamber, the air was heavy with the unspoken certainty of victory. Supreme Arbiter Valzeth, draped in the dark ceremonial robes of the Galactic Council, stood before a massive holoscreen, his golden eyes fixed on the figure seated across from him. Alan Richter, President of the United Earth Council, appeared composed in his modest, dimly lit office. No banners of war adorned the walls, no signs of desperation in his demeanor. His fingers were loosely laced together on his desk, his expression unreadable. He didn't flinch beneath the weight of Valzeth's glare. Valzeth despised humanity, not because of their resilience or ambition, but because of their sheer audacity. Every civilization that had faced the Council's judgment had bowed before its might. Some surrendered out of fear. Others, after futile resistance, collapsed under the weight of overwhelming force. Yet here stood Richter, leader of an insignificant world, unshaken before the greatest military force in the known galaxy. The terms had been made abundantly clear. Humanity would surrender. They would dismantle their weapons, dissolve their military, and place themselves under the direct governance of the Council. In return, they would be spared the horrors of war. Their cities would remain standing. Their people would live. But defiance meant complete annihilation. Valzeth straightened, his voice calm but edged with centuries of authority. You have been given a generous offer, President Richter. Do not mistake our mercy for weakness. He paused, letting the words sink in. This is your final opportunity. Accept our terms, and your people will survive. Refuse, and you will be erased. A long silence followed. Richter exhaled, slow and measured, as if he had already made peace with whatever came next. He leaned forward slightly, his piercing gaze locking onto Valzeth's. We appreciate the offer, he said, but we'll have to decline. A ripple of tension spread across the command deck. Officers exchanged uncertain glances, the quiet murmur of disbelief barely perceptible beneath the hum of machinery. They had anticipated resistance, perhaps even blustered threats, but not this. Richter's refusal was not the response of a desperate man. It was not a bluff, nor the last act of a species backed into a corner. It was a warning. Valzeth's jaw tightened. You understand what you are saying? Richter didn't blink. I do. And so should you. The transmission cut. For the first time in decades, Valzeth hesitated. His pulse quickened, though he crushed the feeling beneath cold logic. Humanity had no way out of this. They were an upstart species, barely a footnote in the Council's records, untested against the might of a true interstellar power. Whatever confidence Richter displayed, it was misplaced. Arrogance bred foolishness, and foolishness led to extinction. With a sharp breath, Valzeth turned to his second-in-command. Initiate the assault. Wipe their fleet from existence. A chorus of confirmations followed. Within moments, the vast Council fleet stirred. Engines flared to life, warships realigning into offensive formations. The sky above Earth darkened with the movement of titanic dreadnoughts, their cannons primed. Thousands of vessels, each capable of reducing entire cities to dust, began their descent. And yet, something was wrong. A sensation curled in Valzeth's gut, unfamiliar and unwelcome. A sliver of unease. He silenced it with reason. This was a routine conquest, a display of overwhelming might. Humanity would fall, just as others had before them. Then the first explosion came. Not from Earth. Not from human ships. From his fleet. It began in the outer ranks, an enormous battleship, its hull splitting apart in a silent inferno. The shockwave rippled outward, a chain reaction of detonations following in quick succession. Blinding bursts of energy swallowed entire formations, ships vanishing into fireballs before they could even return fire. A second, then a third explosion. Panic spread through the command deck. Officers barked conflicting reports. Sensors blared with unreadable signals. No enemy fire had been detected. No projectiles, no energy beams. The ships were simply detonating. Valzetha's hands curled into fists. What is happening? A frantic officer turned to him, face drained of color. Sir, our systems are compromised. Weapons, engines, shielding, nothing is responding. Impossible. The Council's fleets were impenetrable, their technology unmatched. For centuries, they had crushed rebellions and absorbed entire species into their rule. Yet now, their greatest armada was tearing itself apart before it could even engage. Valzetha's mind raced. Had they been betrayed from within? Was this sabotage? No, the humans. It had to be them. But how? Then, through the chaos, a single transmission cut through the static. A voice, calm and composed. Alan Richter. You should have listened, he said. Valzetha's breath caught. He had underestimated them. Gravely. And now, the war was already over. The command deck of Eterna Pax was no longer a place of discipline and order. It was chaos incarnate. Warning sirens shrieked, their shrill cries merging with the shouts of officers scrambling to make sense of the disaster unfolding around them. Supreme Arbiter Valzeth stood at the center of it all, watching his once invincible fleet unravel before his eyes. The explosions hadn't stopped. Entire warships, some of the most advanced in the known galaxy, were disintegrating mid-air. Not from enemy fire. Not from sabotage. They simply ceased to exist in controlled bursts of destruction, as if the very laws of physics had turned against them. This isn't possible, Valzeth muttered. His voice, usually commanding, now barely reached the officer beside him. Our systems, the officer swallowed hard. They've been hijacked, sir. Every ship, every weapon, every defense network. We aren't in control. Valzetha's golden eyes flared with fury. By whom? The officer hesitated. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because it was too absurd to voice aloud. Valzeth knew before he even heard the words. The humans. The very idea was offensive. Humanity, a species barely stepping into the stars, had somehow seized control of the most powerful fleet in existence. It defied logic. It defied reason. And yet, reality left no room for denial. A new transmission cut through the static, reaching every remaining ship in the fleet. The command deck fell into a stunned silence as Alan Richter's voice came through, calm as ever. I did warn you, Arbiter. Valzetha's fists clenched. How? You assumed power lay in numbers, in firepower, Richter said. That was your first mistake. The second, underestimating what desperation can accomplish. Valzeth refused to accept it. This is impossible. Your species doesn't have this level of technology. No, we didn't, Richter admitted. Not until you came for us. Something cold settled in Valzetha's gut. Richter continued. You thought conquering weaker species made you untouchable. But every time you subjugated a world, you left behind survivors. Scientists, engineers, strategists. People who learned from you. You didn't just crush civilizations. You scattered knowledge across the stars, and some of it found its way to us. Valzetha's mind raced. Could it be true? The Council had absorbed hundreds of species into its dominion, stripping them of weapons and warships, believing resistance to be futile. Had they unknowingly built their own undoing? Richter's tone darkened. You studied war, Arbiter. We studied survival. And survival always finds a way. A fresh explosion rocked the Eterna Pax, sending a tremor through the command deck. Panels flickered. Screens went dark. The ship was being unmade beneath his feet. Call for a retreat, Valzeth ordered. No one moved. He turned, eyes blazing. I said retreat. The officer who had spoken earlier swallowed. Sir, we can't. Valzeth grabbed him by the front of his uniform, yanking him closer. What do you mean we can't? The officer barely found the courage to meet his gaze. The fleet is no longer responding to us. We aren't in command anymore. The truth hit like a physical blow. The Council's greatest fleet no longer belonged to the Council. Richter's voice returned, calm yet carrying the weight of finality. It's over, Arbiter. You're finished. Valzetha's hands trembled. Not with fear but rage. Do you think you can replace us? He hissed. You think humanity is ready to rule? We don't want to rule, Richter said. We just want to be left alone. Valzetha's vision darkened at the edges. This was the moment where he should have had a counterattack, a contingency plan, something. But there was nothing. His fleet, his legacy, his authority, gone. Another explosion. Then another. The Eterna Pax trembled. The ship's structure was failing. Richter spoke one last time. The war is over, Valzeth. But what happens next? That depends on you. And then, the transmission cut, leaving Valzeth alone in the ruins of his empire. The wreckage of the Council's fleet drifted through the void, shattered hulls tumbling like the bones of a great beast slain mid-stride. Fires flickered in oxygen pockets, their glow fleeting against the infinite blackness. The Eterna Pax, once the unshakable symbol of the Council's dominion, now hung powerless, its silver plating marred with gaping wounds, its core systems flickering on the brink of collapse. Inside, Supreme Arbiter Valzeth stood motionless at the fractured command console, his golden eyes locked on the ruined expanse of his once mighty armada. The acrid scent of burning circuits hung heavy in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. His officers lay strewn across the deck, some unconscious, others stirring, their uniforms smeared with soot and despair. He had never lost before. Not like this. The defeat was not merely tactical. It was absolute. His fleet had not been outgunned in a glorious battle, nor had it fallen to a superior armada. No, this was worse. The humans had turned his own weapons against him, twisted the very foundation of the Council's strength into a trap so complete, so devastating, that even now, standing amidst the wreckage, he could scarcely grasp how it had happened. The war is over, Valzeth. But what happens next? That depends on you. Richter's words still burned. The humans had not just survived, they had undone centuries of conquest in a matter of minutes. How? How had a species so young, so primitive by Council standards, dismantled an empire that had stood unchallenged for millennia? His fingers curled into a fist. No, that question no longer mattered. Survival came first. He forced himself to inhale deeply, steadying the rage seething beneath his skin. If he allowed himself to succumb to emotion, he would be no better than the countless leaders who had crumbled before the Council's might. He turned sharply. Status report. A young lieutenant, barely out of training, pushed herself to her feet, swaying as she struggled to focus on her console. Her once pristine uniform was torn, her face streaked with blood from a gash on her temple. She swallowed before answering. Primary systems are failing. Shields, weapons, propulsion, completely offline. Backup generators are holding at 30%, but we've lost all external communications. We are completely cut off, sir. The words sat like a stone in his gut. He turned his gaze toward another officer, one of the few veterans still conscious. The man's voice was hoarse, thick with smoke inhalation. Some destroyers remain intact, but they aren't responding to our commands. Valzetha's jaw tightened. Of course they weren't. They weren't his ships anymore. His mind raced. If the Eterna Pax remained adrift, it would soon become a floating tomb. He needed a way out. But there was nowhere to run. No reinforcements to call. The Council itself might already be crumbling. A proximity alert flared on one of the surviving monitors. He turned sharply. A ship was approaching. Not human. Not Council. The officers around him tensed as the vessel came into view. A sleek, dark silhouette against the distant starlight, its design unlike any recorded in the Council's archives. It bore no insignia, no markings of allegiance. A predator without a banner. A transmission request blinked on the screen. A trap? A final insult from the humans? Or something else entirely? His officers exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for him to act. He exhaled sharply and pressed the control. The screen flickered. And there she was. A woman, tall and sharp-eyed, clad in unassuming but functional armor. Not human. Not of any known Council race. There was something deliberate about her presence, something poised, as if she were in complete control. She studied him with detached curiosity, as if she had already decided his fate before the conversation had even begun. "Supreme Arbiter Valzeth," she greeted, her tone laced with amusement. "It seems you've had a difficult day." Valzetha's golden eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The woman tilted her head slightly. Someone who believes your war isn't over yet. A cold silence filled the command deck. The surviving officers turned to him, wary, confused, desperate for direction. Valzeth said nothing, but his mind turned at a relentless pace. She wasn't a scavenger, here to pick at the corpse of a fallen empire. She wasn't a human, gloating over his ruin. No, she had come for him. Hope had no place in Valzetha's heart. Hope was for the conquered, the weak, the desperate. But strategy, that was something else entirely. The war might be over, but wars had a way of starting again. The woman's face remained unreadable, her sharp gaze measuring Valzeth in a way that made his skin crawl. He had spent centuries commanding the most feared armada in the galaxy, yet here, aboard his crippled flagship, under the scrutiny of a stranger, he felt something disturbingly foreign: vulnerability. The transmission flickered, her ship's dim interior barely visible beyond the glow of her control panel. No insignia, no familiar architecture, nothing to suggest allegiance to any known faction. A rogue element. That made her either a fool or something far worse. Valzeth straightened, suppressing the exhaustion weighing down his limbs. "You know my name," he said. "That suggests you've been watching." "Why?" She smirked, an expression devoid of warmth. "You think the Council's collapse went unnoticed? Half the galaxy was waiting for you to fall. The other half helped make it happen." A slow, calculating dread coiled in his gut. This wasn't just a single defeat. The foundations of the Empire had been crumbling for longer than he realized. "Who are you?" he pressed. "A problem solver," she replied. "And right now, you're a problem in need of a solution." The officers around him stiffened. A few instinctively reached for weapons they no longer had, their instincts struggling to catch up with their powerlessness. Valzeth held up a hand, silencing them. "You expect me to believe that you came here to dispose of me?" "No," she said simply. "If I wanted you dead, your ship would already be scrap." Her confidence was infuriating. He had met many who wielded power, but none who carried it with such quiet certainty. She spoke like someone who had already decided how this would end. "So what is it you do want?" he asked. She tilted her head, considering her words. "The galaxy doesn't need the Council anymore," she said. "But it does need order. You understand that better than anyone." A quiet murmur rippled through the bridge. This was no scavenger, no opportunist hoping to rob the dying. She had come with intent. "You want me to rebuild what has already fallen?" Valzeth asked, voice tight with disdain. "You think the galaxy will rally behind me after this humiliation?" She leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "Not as you are now. But power isn't about pride, arbiter. It's about survival." The word struck a nerve. The idea of ruling a broken empire, of clawing his way back from the depths of disgrace, was an insult. And yet, it was also a possibility. A path forward. He hated that she saw it before he did. Valzeth exhaled sharply. "Why help me?" A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Amusement, or maybe curiosity. "Because you're predictable," she said. "And in a galaxy teetering on chaos, predictability is valuable." He didn't like that answer, but he understood it. "Say I agree," he said. "What's your plan?" She smiled then, a slow, knowing expression. "Step 1? Get you off that dying ship." For the first time since the battle, Valzeth allowed himself a ghost of a smile. It seemed the war wasn't over after all. Valzeth stepped onto the sleek, unfamiliar deck of the mysterious woman's ship, his boots making a hollow sound against the metal floor. The air was sterile, laced with the faint scent of ozone and polished steel. The lighting was subdued, casting long shadows that stretched toward the edges of a space he didn't yet understand. His officers had been left behind aboard the Eterna Pax, stranded with the wreckage of their former glory. He hadn't said goodbye. Two silent figures flanked him, their dark uniforms devoid of any insignia. They moved with the precision of trained soldiers, but their faces betrayed nothing. No fear, no hostility, not even curiosity. They were professionals, but whose professionals remained unknown. The woman, his enigmatic rescuer, or perhaps his captor, walked ahead without looking back. Her movements were unhurried, confident, as if she already knew he would follow. Valzeth had been aboard countless ships in his lifetime, from the gilded war halls of the Council to the sterile command decks of fleets that had conquered entire civilizations. This was different. There was no wasted space, no ornamentation, nothing meant to impress. It was a vessel built for function, and function alone. He broke the silence. No markings. No flags. You move through the void as if you don't exist. The woman didn't slow her pace. You're catching on. And yet, here you are, plucking the former supreme arbiter from the ruins of his own failure. That suggests you do exist, at least to some. She stopped at a reinforced door. It slid open without a sound, revealing a dimly lit chamber lined with control panels and a single central console. A star map flickered to life, the galaxy stretching across the room in a projection of light and shadow. She gestured for him to step inside. He didn't. Enough games, he said. Who are you? She turned to face him fully for the first time since they'd left his ruined flagship. The dim glow of the map painted her features in shifting blues and purples, making her expression unreadable. My name is Saris, she said. I lead a faction that doesn't officially exist. Not to the Council, not to the humans, not to anyone who matters. Valzeth studied her, waiting for a flicker of deception, a hesitation in her words. He found none. And what does this faction want? To ensure that whatever comes next is not dictated by the victors of this war, she said. A chill settled in his spine, but he forced his voice to remain steady. You believe the humans shouldn't rule. I believe no one should rule, she corrected. Empires rise, they rot, and they fall. The Council was not the first. It won't be the last. The question isn't whether the humans will rule, it's whether they should be allowed to make the same mistakes you did. His jaw clenched. You speak as if the Council was some mindless, bloated beast. We maintained order. We gave structure to chaos. She raised an eyebrow. And yet, here we are. For the first time in a long while, he had no response. She stepped closer, just enough that he could see the sharp calculation in her eyes. You want revenge, she said. That much is obvious. But revenge is a blunt instrument, arbiter. I'm offering something sharper. He exhaled slowly. Which is? A chance to dismantle what you helped build, she said. Not to reclaim it. Not to replace it. To burn it down properly this time, so it doesn't crawl back from the ashes. Valzeth had expected many things in the wake of his defeat. Death, exile, humiliation. But not this. Not an offer from a ghost faction that had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Why me? He asked. Because you understand power, she said. You understand the cost of it. And because, whether you admit it or not, you know that what you built was always going to end this way. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. She was wrong, of course. The Council had been flawed, but it had been necessary. If it had failed, it was because of circumstances beyond its control. Because of the humans. Because of... He stopped himself. Was that true? Or was he merely repeating the same justifications that had led to this moment? Saris turned back toward the console, as if giving him the space to process the weight of his own thoughts. If you want to live in the ruins of what was, I'll drop you on the nearest habitable moon and let you rot there. But if you want to do something, she glanced at him, eyes glinting with something he couldn't quite name, then I suggest you start making peace with the idea that the galaxy you knew is gone. Valzeth closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, listening to the hum of the ship around him. He had spent centuries bending the universe to his will. Now, for the first time, he stood in the gravity of something larger than himself. When he opened his eyes, he met hers without flinching. What do you need me to do? Saris smiled. Now, they were getting somewhere. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the viewport, a silent audience to the conversation unfolding within the dimly lit chamber. Valzeth stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid, though his mind was anything but. For the first time in centuries, he was no longer giving orders, no longer dictating the fate of empires. He was listening. Saris moved with a confidence that unsettled him, like a woman who had already mapped out the future and was merely guiding others toward it. The projection before them flickered, a schematic of the galactic core, red indicators highlighting key systems once under the Council's control. I assume you know what these are, she said, tilting her head toward the display. Valzetha's gaze swept over the markers. Even in the Council's prime, these locations had been carefully managed, their existence known only to those at the highest levels of command. "The vaults," he murmured. Saris nodded. The Council didn't just enforce order. It hoarded power. Knowledge, technology, artifacts from civilizations you wiped out before they could become threats. She gestured at one marker. "These are all that remain of your empire. The last vestiges of the authority you lost." Valzeth exhaled slowly, staring at the projection. He had always known the Council operated beyond the public eye, but even he had not been privy to the full extent of its hidden caches. These vaults contained weapons of unfathomable potential, ancient machinery that could shift the balance of power in an instant. Whoever controlled them controlled the future. "You intend to seize them," he said. It wasn't a question. Saris folded her arms. "I intend to ensure they don't fall into the hands of fools." "Like the humans," Valzeth added. She smirked. "Like anyone." He studied her, trying to discern the angle she wasn't revealing. Every faction had motives, every leader an agenda. He had spent centuries crushing resistance movements, outmaneuvering rebels who claimed to act in the name of balance or justice. They always wanted power in the end. Saris was different. He could see it in her measured words, the way she withheld just enough information to keep him guessing. "You claim you want to dismantle the old order," he said, watching for a reaction. "But to do that, you must replace it with something else. Power does not simply vanish." She nodded. "No, but it can be redistributed." Valzeth let out a low chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "You speak of balance as if it's something that can be maintained. As if chaos does not creep in the moment structure is removed." Saris tapped a command into the console, and the projection shifted. "That's why I need you," she admitted. "You understand control. You know what happens when power consolidates. You also know what happens when it crumbles. You've seen both ends of the cycle." "And what do I gain?" Valzeth asked. She met his gaze without hesitation. "A legacy that isn't defined by failure." The word struck like a blade honed to perfection. Precise, deliberate, unavoidable. His legacy. That was what truly lingered in the ashes of his empire. Not just what he had lost, but how he had lost it. If history remembered him at all, it would be as the last arbiter of a fallen order, a relic of a dying ideology. Unless he rewrote the ending himself. He turned back to the projection, considering the locations, the possibilities. He had spent his life ensuring that chaos never took root, crushing rebellion before it could spread. Now he would do the opposite. He would unmake what remained of the Council, not in anger, not in vengeance, but with precision. With purpose. Valzeth exhaled, feeling the weight of his decision settle into place. "Where do we begin?" Saris's smile was small, approving. "Where all revolutions begin," she said. "At the foundations." And with that, the last supreme arbiter of the Council stepped into the future, not as a ruler, but as an architect of its undoing.